46 years ago today, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior. All 29 crew members aboard died. It was the largest ship to ever sink in the Great Lakes. Resting place is now 530 feet below the lake's surface.
For years, the Edmund Fitzgerald was just a shipwreck. But what the underwater drone captures is not decay, not history. It's something far darker, something that should never have been disturbed. And once you see it, you'll understand why this wreck was meant to stay hidden forever.
Discovered the first missing crewman.
Unexpected.
They went so close that they recorded the entire face, the body, and these mysterious blocks that were on the body that looked like bricks. But later on, we figured out that was a cork life vest.
His hour and a half with the Fitz is burned into his brain.
We couldn't believe it.
Forever.
I really wish I could go back someday.
Before she became a tragic headline, the Fitzgerald was one of the most celebrated vessels on the Great Lakes. To understand why her loss was so shocking, it's important to look back at her beginnings, her purpose, and the reputation she carried throughout her service.
No divers have returned to the Fitzgerald since Rick's visit in 2004. He hopes on the 50th anniversary, which is in 2025, he could travel back down to the wreck site and explore it again. We have more information in the web version of this story at 13onyourside.com.
I've seen pictures of the Fitzgerald, but had no idea how intact it would be. The bow section looks like it could still sail, and as you went through and saw the damage, it was very sobering, beat up and buried into the mud where that ship came down with such force into what looks like an underwater hill or a half mountain, if you will.
The SS Edmund Fitzgerald was launched in 1958 from the shipyards of River Rouge, Michigan. At the time, she was considered a marvel of shipbuilding on the Great Lakes, measuring 729 feet in length. She was the largest freighter ever built for service on these inland seas. Her sheer size meant she could haul massive quantities of taconite iron ore, the raw material needed for steel production. The job was straightforward: transport ore from the mines near Duluth, Minnesota, to industrial hubs like Detroit and Toledo, where it would be turned into steel for cars, buildings, and machinery. The ship was commissioned by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company, which was unusual. Life insurance companies didn't typically order and own freighters, but the company's chairman, Edmund Fitzgerald, had a strong personal interest in shipping, and he lent his name to the vessel. That name would become famous in ways no one could have predicted. From the start, the Fitzgerald stood out. Her gleaming white superstructure and burgundy hull were easy to recognize. Her proportions, sleek lines, and size gave her an elegance that went beyond function. For many, she wasn't just another freighter. She became a symbol of progress, industry, and power. Onlookers along the Great Lakes often stopped to watch her pass by. Children in port towns knew her name, and tourists took photographs when she glided beneath bridges or into harbors. The crew who worked aboard the Fitzgerald also developed a strong connection with her. She was known for her speed as well as her size, and she built a reputation for reliable service. Some of her voyages broke records for the amount of ore carried, and she quickly became respected among sailors. Crew members often served on her for years, and their loyalty was well known. Captain Ernest McSorley, who would later command her on her final voyage, was one of the most experienced captains on the Great Lakes. His belief in the ship mirrored that of his men. They trusted her strength and capability completely. The Fitzgerald also became a sight worth waiting for. Families gathered on bridges or at waterfronts just to watch her move past. When she sailed under the Mackinac Bridge, a vital link between Michigan's upper and lower peninsulas, the event was almost a spectacle. The ship's horn echoed across the water, and many felt a sense of pride in seeing such a giant pass gracefully below. In those years, she wasn't just another working freighter. She was, as many called her, the pride of the American side. But it wasn't only beauty and spectacle. Life on board was still hard work. The Great Lakes are well known for their unpredictability. Weather could change in a matter of hours, shifting from calm conditions to sudden storms. Ice in winter, heavy fog, and powerful winds always posed a risk. The Fitzgerald faced all of these challenges during her 17 years of service, yet she seemed to brush them aside. Unlike many other ships, she hadn't experienced a serious accident. No lives had been lost under her watch. By the early 1970s, she was considered one of the most dependable vessels on the water. In fact, her reputation was so strong that some even considered her unsinkable. That word, often used too casually in maritime history, is one that hindsight treats harshly. But at the time it was common to hear. A ship as large, modern and successful as the Fitzgerald inspired confidence. To many who sailed on her or simply admired her from the shore, she seemed immune to the dangers of the lake. During a typical run, the Fitzgerald carried more than 26,000 tons of ore. This cargo was vital to the American economy of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, as the industrial heartland produced cars and steel products that fueled growth. Her presence was more than symbolic. She was an active link in a chain that connected mining towns to manufacturing centers. Each crossing mattered. Each ton of ore she carried meant jobs and industry far from the shores of Lake Superior. By the middle of her career, the Fitzgerald had completed hundreds of voyages. For many in the shipping industry, she represented both reliability and prestige. Even sailors on other freighters respected her size, her speed, and her clean record. She was admired not just as a machine but as an icon. Some have even suggested she had a personality of her own, one that inspired a kind of affection rare in commercial shipping. Still, not everything about life on the Fitzgerald was glamorous. Crews faced long hours, physical work, and the constant challenge of weather. The Great Lakes can be some of the most dangerous waters in the world. Because they are inland seas, storms can rise quickly and without much warning. The lake's size means waves can build to ocean-like heights, but the surrounding land traps winds and currents in unpredictable ways. Mariners often say that a storm on the Great Lakes can feel harsher than one on the open ocean. The Fitzgerald had endured many of these conditions, and each successful voyage seemed to add to her legend. By 1970, the Fitzgerald's record stood strong. More than 700 successful trips, no major mishaps, and a reputation as one of the most trusted ships afloat. Few could imagine anything changing that status. When she was scheduled to carry iron ore pellets from Superior, Wisconsin to Detroit in November 1975, it was just another job. At least that's how it seemed at the time. The ship left port on the afternoon of November 9, 1975. On board were 29 men, including Captain McSorley, who planned to retire at the end of that shipping season. He was a respected leader, cautious yet confident, and his experience on the Great Lakes gave many reassurance that whatever weather lay ahead, he could handle it. Another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, was making the same trip on a similar course. The two ships had crossed paths many times before. For the crews it was routine, but the Great Lakes are never predictable. While the Fitzgerald left harbor with little concern, the weather was already turning. A low-pressure system was moving into the region, one that would soon develop into one of the worst storms ever recorded on Lake Superior. For now, though, no one knew just how dangerous it would become. The Fitzgerald's departure was not remarkable in itself. She had faced storms before, and she had come through them every time. To all appearances, this was nothing different. On the morning of November 10, 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald was still making her way across Lake Superior. The ship had left port the previous afternoon, carrying more than 26,000 tons of iron ore pellets. At first the voyage seemed routine, but by the early hours of that Monday, conditions on the lake had turned severe. The Fitzgerald was now heading directly into one of the most violent storms in the history of the Great Lakes. The Fitzgerald was not alone. Another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, had been traveling in the same general direction. Throughout the night and morning, the two ships kept in contact, providing updates on their locations and the worsening weather. This companionship was not unusual. Ships often sailed within sight or radar range of each other for awareness and reassurance, especially during storms. As daylight came on November 10th, the weather showed no signs of easing. Winds were reported to be reaching speeds of more than 70 miles per hour. Waves climbed to over 25 feet, slamming against the hulls of the ships. Freezing rain and snow added to the difficulty, cutting visibility and making navigation even more dangerous. Storms of this magnitude were rare, but they were not unheard of on Lake Superior. Still, few mariners had ever faced conditions as brutal as these. Captain Ernest McSorley of the Fitzgerald was known as a calm and seasoned leader. He kept steady communication with the Arthur M. Anderson, reporting the ship's progress and any problems that arose. Early in the afternoon, he radioed the Anderson to report that the Fitzgerald had a bad list and had lost a vent. He also mentioned that one of the hatch covers was giving trouble. For a ship carrying thousands of tons of cargo, a list meant she was leaning to one side, which could be dangerous if it worsened. Despite these issues, McSorley's voice remained controlled. He assured the Anderson that the situation was being managed. Throughout the day, the two ships pressed on through the storm. The Fitzgerald had fallen slightly ahead of the Anderson, but remained visible on radar. Both vessels battled the same towering waves, strong gusts, and icy spray. The crew of the Anderson later described the conditions as some of the worst they had ever experienced. By early evening, the storm had reached its peak intensity. At 7:10 p.m., McSorley made what would become his final transmission. Over the radio, he told the Anderson, "We are holding our own." There was no panic in his words, no hint that disaster was moments away. His tone gave the impression of a captain who believed he had things under control. Just minutes later, the Anderson's radar screen showed nothing where the Fitzgerald had been. The massive ship had vanished without warning. There were no distress calls, no emergency flares, and no further radio messages. One moment she was there, fighting the storm, and the next she was gone. The crew of the Anderson tried repeatedly to make contact, but received no reply. Within minutes, they realized the Fitzgerald had disappeared completely. They immediately notified the Coast Guard, and a search effort was launched. Aircraft, helicopters, and other vessels joined in, scouring the stormy waters of Lake Superior for any sign of the freighter or her crew. The search yielded almost nothing. Small bits of debris and a light coating of oil on the water were all that could be found. Not a single life raft or body was ever recovered. It was as though the Fitzgerald and her 29 men had simply vanished. The suddenness of the loss made the tragedy even harder to understand. Ships had gone down on the Great Lakes before, but rarely had one so large and so well regarded disappeared, without even a call for help. In the days that followed, attention turned to finding the wreck. Using sonar, search teams eventually located the remains of the Fitzgerald, lying more than 500 feet beneath the surface of Lake Superior. The ship was broken in two, with the bow section upright in the mud, and the stern section inverted and twisted a short distance away. The sight of such a massive vessel torn apart at the bottom of the lake confirmed that something catastrophic had taken place, but it did not explain what. From the beginning, the mystery of the Fitzgerald's sinking captured public attention. People asked how a ship of her size and reputation could be lost so suddenly. Families of the crew wanted answers. Maritime experts began proposing theories, but no single explanation could be proven with certainty. One idea was that the ship had been hit by rogue waves. These are unusually large waves that appear suddenly and can overwhelm even large vessels. Reports from the night of the storm indicated that waves more than 30 feet high were possible. Some believed a series of these waves could have struck the Fitzgerald, driving her down before the crew had time to react. Another theory suggested that the ship may have run aground on a shoal, an underwater ridge in the lake. Charts of the area at the time were not always precise, and in poor visibility, it was possible the Fitzgerald struck something unseen. A grounding could have torn open the hull, causing rapid flooding. Others pointed to possible structural failure. After 17 years of service, the Fitzgerald had endured thousands of hours of stress on her hull and deck. Metal fatigue, combined with the violent motion of the storm, might have caused her to break apart on the surface before she went down. The official Coast Guard investigation, completed in 1977, concluded that the likely cause of the sinking was failure of the hatch covers. According to this theory, heavy seas may have damaged or loosened the clamps holding the cargo hatches shut, allowing water to leak into the holds. With so much weight already on board, even a slow but steady flooding could have made the ship unstable and pulled her under. However, many disagreed with this conclusion. Families of the crew felt the report unfairly suggested human error, implying that the sailors had not properly secured the hatches. Supporters of the crew argued that Captain McSorley and his men were highly skilled and would not have overlooked such an important task. They believed the failure was more likely due to design limitations or structural weaknesses, not crew negligence. The National Transportation Safety Board later offered a different possibility. Their theory leaned towards structural failure, suggesting the Fitzgerald may have broken apart on the surface due to extreme stress. With conflicting conclusions, the debate only grew. For years, the mystery of the Fitzgerald's sinking continued to spark discussion. Historians, engineers, and maritime unions each had their own interpretations of the evidence. Without survivors or a clear record of the ship's final moments, certainty remained out of reach. What made the tragedy especially haunting was not just the loss itself, but the way it happened. A giant ship with a strong reputation vanished in minutes, leaving nothing but silence. There was no warning, no time for the crew to send out a mayday, and no last words for their families. For those left behind, that silence was the hardest part to accept. Nearly 50 years after the Edmund Fitzgerald disappeared beneath Lake Superior, technology finally caught up with the mystery. For decades, divers and submersibles had visited the wreck, but their tools were limited. Early expeditions in the 1980s and 1990s produced grainy footage and low-resolution sonar images. These surveys confirmed the ship's general condition, broken into two major sections resting on the lake bed, but they could not explain the finer details. Many questions remained unanswered, especially about how the ship failed so suddenly. By the 2020s, however, advancements in underwater robotics offered a chance to look again with fresh eyes. In 2023, a new expedition launched with one mission to capture the clearest view yet of the Edmund Fitzgerald. This time, investigators brought a remotely operated vehicle, equipped with advanced cameras, high-powered floodlights, precision sonar, and artificial intelligence to assist with mapping. Unlike earlier machines, this ROV was small enough to navigate tight spaces, but powerful enough to withstand the pressures at a depth of over 500 feet. Engineers described it as a surgical tool, capable of documenting the wreck without disturbing it. The dive began before dawn, with the research vessel positioned directly above the wreck's GPS coordinates. The lake's surface was calm, a stark contrast to the violent storm that had sent the Fitzgerald to the bottom decades earlier. The ROV slipped quietly into the dark water, its tether unspooling as it descended. Inside the control room, screens lit up with the first live images. At first, all that appeared was murky water, filled with drifting particles. Then, slowly, the outline of steel began to emerge from the gloom. "There she is," one crew member whispered, as the bow of the Fitzgerald came into view. The bow stood upright in the sediment, towering like a wall. Years of rust and sediment coated the hull, but the ship's immense scale was still striking. Fish moved sluggishly through the water, weaving in and out of openings in the wreck. The drone circled carefully, revealing the cargo hatches, the battered deck, and the collapsed superstructure. A short distance away, the stern lay inverted and twisted, a chaotic mass of steel that spoke of enormous force. At first, the wreck appeared calm, almost peaceful. There were no signs of fire, no evidence of explosion, and no obvious signs of a collision. It looked as if the ship had simply sunk and settled into place. But as the drone moved closer, the details began to tell a different story. One of the first surprises came from the cargo hatches. These hatches covered the enormous holds where more than 26,000 tons of ore had been stored. Each hatch was meant to be sealed tight with 22 heavy steel clamps. These clamps were crucial. They kept water out during storms, forming the barrier between the waves above and the cargo below. But the drone's cameras showed something troubling. Several clamps were missing entirely. Others were twisted or bent backwards, as if torn off by immense force. The operators adjusted the drone's position to get a clearer look. The damage was not isolated. Across multiple hatches, clamps were either gone or visibly compromised. This was not just one failure. It was a pattern. The evidence suggested that during the storm, water may have entered the cargo holds through these weakened or missing seals. With the weight of thousands of tons of ore already pressing down, even a small amount of water could have made the ship dangerously unstable. Then came another discovery. On the forward deck, the cameras captured a destroyed vent pipe. This pipe had been designed to allow air to escape during loading operations, preventing pressure from building up inside the cargo hold. But in the wreck, the pipe was completely sheared off, leaving a hole several inches wide that led directly into the hold. To an untrained eye, it might not have looked significant. To the engineers watching, it was alarming. In heavy seas, that hole would have been a direct funnel for water. One of the experts on board described it bluntly. That's a 4-inch opening straight into the ship's lungs. The findings began to paint a clearer picture. The Fitzgerald may not have broken apart on the surface or been destroyed by a single catastrophic event. Instead, she may have been slowly overwhelmed. As the storm raged, water forced its way in through missing clamps and the broken vent. The ship was flooding from above, and the crew may not have realized how quickly it was happening. Simulations run during the expedition suggested a chilling scenario. Water could have been entering the hold at a rate of more than 4,000 gallons per minute. At that speed, even a vessel the size of the Fitzgerald could become unstable within half an hour. This possibility gave new meaning to Captain McSorley's last words, "We are holding our own." He may have believed the ship was still under control, unaware that beneath his feet, the Fitzgerald was already drowning. The high-resolution cameras revealed even more. Along the edges of the hatch coamings, the raised frames around each cargo hatch, streaks of sediment could be seen. These streaks suggested water had actively flowed through the seals before the ship went down. In some places, the sediment trailed inside the hatch, clear evidence that water had entered the cargo hold. For investigators, this was confirmation that hatch and vent failure played a critical role in the sinking. Another detail emerged as the footage was reviewed more carefully. Some clamps appeared to be replacements, not original parts from 1950. They may have been installed during maintenance or retrofitting in the years before the sinking. If so, it meant the ship had a known history of stress on its hatch hardware. This raised new questions about inspection and repair practices. Were these problems noticed but underestimated? Did maintenance crews realize how vital the clamps were during a storm? The evidence unsettled the experts reviewing the footage. For decades, the idea that hatch covers might have failed had been treated as speculation. Now, there was physical proof. Missing clamps, twisted metal, and a destroyed vent all pointed to a gradual flooding event that the crew could not see. The Fitzgerald had not been ripped apart instantly by outside forces. She had been undone from above, silently, until she could no longer stay afloat. For the families of the crew, the discovery was both painful and clarifying. It suggested the sailors had not made mistakes or ignored their duties. They had done everything right, but the ship itself had let them down. Design limitations, wear and tear, and overlooked weaknesses in critical hardware had conspired against them. The expedition's work did more than confirm suspicions about the Fitzgerald. It highlighted how vulnerable ships of her era could be. The clamps and vents were standard features on many Great Lakes freighters built in the mid-20th century. The lack of backup systems or secondary seals meant that if these features failed, there was no safeguard. The Fitzgerald's sinking was not just about one ship, it raised questions about an entire generation of vessels. As the ROV completed its survey, the team collected thousands of images and hours of video footage. Advanced software turned these into detailed 3D models of the wreck. Every rivet, every fracture, every streak of sediment was captured at millimeter resolution. For the first time, investigators had a complete digital record of the Edmund Fitzgerald and her final resting place. This data would allow engineers and historians to study the wreck in ways that had never before been possible. The drone dive into the darkness of Lake Superior revealed more than just a shipwreck. It offered a glimpse into the final minutes of a vessel once considered unsinkable. The Fitzgerald had not exploded, collided, or simply vanished. She had been slowly, quietly pulled under by design flaws and relentless waves. For the experts who reviewed the evidence, the discovery was sobering. It meant that other ships of the same era may have faced similar risks, and it forced a re-examination of assumptions about maritime safety on the Great Lakes. The modern expedition to the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald brought answers that people had been searching for over nearly 5 decades. But as much as the findings helped explain what happened on that night in November 1975, they also raised new questions and in some ways deepened the sense of loss. The drone footage showed clear evidence of missing hatch clamps, bent steel, and a destroyed vent pipe. Together, these details told the story of a ship that had not been torn apart instantly, but had been overwhelmed gradually by water entering where it should never have been able to. For experts, this was confirmation of long-held theories. For families, it shifted the way the tragedy was understood. From the moment the footage was released, naval engineers and maritime historians studied it with close attention. To a casual observer, the damage might have looked like rust or ordinary wear after decades underwater. To professionals, it revealed critical points of failure. The clamps were not decorative fittings. They were essential to keeping the ship watertight. Each of the Fitzgerald's 21 hatch covers was designed to be held in place by 22 clamps, a total of 462. When they were missing or broken, the barrier between the raging surface and the ship's cargo holds was compromised. The destroyed vent pipe told an equally troubling story. What should have been a controlled channel for airflow during loading had become an open funnel for freezing lake water. Investigators realized this single weakness could have accelerated flooding at a rate of thousands of gallons per minute. It explained how the Fitzgerald could have seemed stable one moment and then vanished from radar minutes later without any distress call. The crew might never have realized just how quickly the ship was sinking beneath them. For experts, the findings were unsettling not only because they explained the past, but because they suggested wider implications. Many freighters of the same era had similar hatch and vent designs. The Fitzgerald was once considered one of the strongest ships on the Great Lakes, but the drone footage showed how vulnerable she had really been. If one of the largest and most admired vessels could be lost to failing clamps and vents, then other ships might have carried the same risks. The discoveries forced a reconsideration of safety standards. In the years since 1975, shipping regulations on the Great Lakes had improved, but the footage showed how small, overlooked weaknesses could turn fatal. Some maritime safety advocates began to call for renewed inspections of older freighters, even those retired or kept for museum display. They argued that lessons from the Fitzgerald should not remain limited to history books, but should guide modern safety practices. For families of the 29 men lost, the discoveries brought mixed emotions. Many had long rejected the idea that crew negligence played a role in the disaster. They felt the Coast Guard's 1977 report unfairly placed blame on the sailors by suggesting improperly secured hatches caused the tragedy. The drone footage gave them some relief, showing that the problem was more complex. The crew had not been careless. They had been caught in a situation they could not have seen or controlled. Captain McSorley's last transmission, "We are holding our own," sounded different in light of the new evidence. It was no longer a sign of denial or false confidence. It was a truthful assessment from a man who did not know water was already rushing into his ship below deck. Yet, for all the clarity, the findings also brought pain. The idea that the ship's design flaws, maintenance history, or overlooked weaknesses doomed the crew made the loss feel preventable. The knowledge that small failures in hardware, clamps, vents, and seals could have sealed the fate of 29 men left families with difficult questions. Could better inspections have saved them? Could stricter regulations have forced improvements? And how many other ships sailed with similar vulnerabilities? The broader maritime community also reflected on the tragedy in new ways. Naval architects pointed out that ships built in the 1950s and 1960s lacked many of the safeguards that are standard today. Double hull construction, secondary seals, and advanced flood detection systems were not part of the Fitzgerald's design. Survival depended entirely on every clamp and cover being in perfect working order, even in extreme storms. The footage showed that this expectation was unrealistic. No ship, no matter how large, should rely on single points of failure. The implications extended beyond the Great Lakes. Around the world, shipbuilders and regulators recognized that many vessels designed in the mid-20th century shared similar vulnerabilities. The Fitzgerald story became a case study in how assumptions of strength and safety can mask underlying weaknesses. It was a reminder that even a ship once called unsinkable could be lost in silence, with no time for its crew to react. For the public, the new discoveries reignited interest in a story that had already become part of cultural memory. The sinking of the Edmund Fitzgerald had inspired books, documentaries, and even songs. But now, the legend was stripped of some of its myths. No longer was it necessary to imagine rogue waves or supernatural forces. The truth was sober design flaws, combined with a powerful storm, brought the great ship down. It was less mysterious, but perhaps more tragic, because it suggested the disaster could have been avoided. Universities, historical societies, and maritime museums began to host discussions about the findings. The footage was shown in classrooms and lectures, where students studied the technical details of the wreck. Experts debated the balance between human error and design limits. Some argued that the evidence absolved the crew completely. Others insisted it highlighted the shared responsibility of shipbuilders, owners, and regulators, who failed to anticipate long-term stresses on vessels. For families, closure was elusive. The footage gave answers, but it did not bring their loved ones back. The absence of distress calls still haunted them, a reminder of how suddenly life can end at sea. The knowledge that the men did everything they could, only to be betrayed by their ship, was both comforting and devastating. It shifted blame away from them, but also underscored the unfairness of their fate. The Fitzgerald's final secret, revealed after nearly half a century, was not a tale of heroics or freak accidents. It was a story of silence, gradual failure, and lessons unlearned. The wreck at the bottom of Lake Superior is no longer just a site of curiosity. It is a message about the importance of maintenance, design, and the relentless force of nature. Even now the ship remains in place, protected as a gravesite for the 29 men who went down with her. Out of respect, human divers rarely visit. The work is left to machines, which can document without disturbing. For many that is fitting. The men who served aboard the Fitzgerald deserve dignity in their final resting place, even as technology helps uncover the truth. The story of the Edmund Fitzgerald is not only about loss, it is also about progress. Each investigation, each new discovery, has added to the body of knowledge that makes shipping safer today. The tragedy taught hard lessons about the need for better regulations, more robust designs, and constant vigilance against complacency. These lessons remain relevant, reminding us that no ship is too strong to fail. As the data from the drone survey continues to be studied, more details may emerge. But the central message is already clear. The Fitzgerald did not simply vanish into mystery. She sank because of weaknesses that were overlooked, vulnerabilities hidden beneath her proud reputation. Her story is a warning that technology and tradition must always adapt to the forces of nature. Almost 50 years after that November storm, the Edmund Fitzgerald continues to speak, not through survivors or signals, but through the evidence preserved in steel on the lakebed. Her silence is no longer total. The message is there for anyone willing to listen. Ships, like people, are not invincible, and the smallest failures can carry the heaviest costs.